all, and I'm so glad that we finally have made this evening with Alasdair. It was very disappointing last month, but we made the right decision. The weather was dire, these steps would have been hopeless, and tonight the weather was lovely. So, thanks to you all for coming. It's really good to see so many people, and as I suspected, there are more men than women. Thought that was going to be the case. Anyway, I'm delighted to welcome Alasdair of Gress Angling Association. And for many years, his annual reports and Lochatour News have given me a lot of pleasure, and his enthusiasm for the subject is very apparent in these reports and all he does throughout the year. I think that's all I need to say, really. It's a subject, the history of Gress River and angling is a subject close to my heart. I was brought up in a house with a lot of talk of Meps and Tobies and Black Pearls and Greenwell's Glory and maybe they're all different names nowadays, I don't know. So anyway, Alasdair, without any more ado, thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that. The way this talk's going to go tonight, I first of all attempted myself to do the speaking and the slides simultaneously, but it turned into a complete problem. So Colin's going to be doing the slides as directed by myself. So thanks very much for coming. When they first invited me to do this talk, I didn't really think there'd be many people interested. I thought we'd have our usual half dozen that come to the Gress Angling AGM and that would be it. But I see there's a good crowd here tonight. So, in relatively recent times, there's been a few articles written about Gress River. The late George Stewart Charlesioyan and Kenny McKeever, Kenny Connaughton, they've done articles for the Common Echtry before. As Anna said, I've been doing reports for the Lochatour News over the last 20 years and hopefully continue doing it. On a national basis, the renowned sports author David S.D. Jones has also done extensive research into the sporting history of the Gress Estates, and his efforts are contained in his books Sporting Estates of the Outer Hebrides and Salmon and Seathird Angling in the Outer Hebrides. Next slide, Paul. And you can go to the next one as well. Okay. I've been in touch recently with Mr. Jones, and he's managed to find all the catch returns from pretty much 1870 through to 1940, which is an incredible achievement considering we had absolutely about 10 years during that period, up till 2 months ago. So we'll go more into that later on. There's a much older book as well, Days in Thule With Rod, Gun and Camera, written in 1894 by the angling correspondent for the Field magazine, Charles Henry Cook, under the pseudonym John Bickerdyke. Next slide, Colin. He spent a season at Gress Lodge in 1894, and the book is really very good reading. Anybody that's interested at all, not just in fishing, but anything to do with Gress, and there's other activities involved in it. It's a really good buy. Original copies of it are very, very rare. I happen to have one. I got one about 30 odd years ago. Ian Roxburgh's got one, and I think Jai's got one. So I think 3 of the only copies that are going on the island seem to be in this room tonight. But it really is an entertaining read, and it is available. Reissues have been done of it, so anybody that's interested, it's a really good read. For tonight's talk, I would like to first of all briefly go over the main events of the sporting history of Gress, and then from a more local level take on a tour from the Gress estuary to Loch Gress, highlighting areas of local interest. I can guarantee it won't take as long doing that as it is walking it, so you'll be okay there. The 30,000 acre Gress estate, which originally formed part of the North Shootings, including the present-day Barves and Galson estates, was first offered to let by Sir James Matheson in 1850. This included accommodation in Gress House, as it was then known, and the use of Gress, Coll and Barves rivers. A darker side of this period were the events leading up to this, when in the latter years of the Seaforth Mackenzies, who owned Lewis up to Sir James Matheson era, who purchased the island in 1844, landowners throughout the Highlands were reprioritising the use of land, resulting in evictions or clearances of whole villages to form either vast farms or sporting estates. Gress was not immune from this, and indeed the taxman at Gress, up to his death in 1845, and Mr. Lewis McNever, was one of the more notorious advocates of this policy of evicting subtenants at Gress to the outer reaches of the estate, despite them having paid their rents. In John MacDonald's book, Lewis, A History of the Island, it is documented that Gress was one of the villages in Lewis which had been cleared of its subtenants by 1844. It would take nearly 80 years for the crofting tenants to get land in Gress again. David Jones's books fully cover the list of tenants who took out a lease on Gress, so I shall only cover some of the more interesting characters. Next slide, I think, Colin. A 10-year lease at an annual rent of £250 was obtained by Charles Newton of London in 1865. Believe it or not, that be the equivalent of around £33,000 in today's money, taking inflation over the period into account. At around this time, Gress House was completely refurbished and converted to a shooting lodge known as Gress Lodge, with a newly built accommodation and kennels added. At this time also, the Barvis or western section of the estate was removed and turned into a new sporting estate. Game books for the time show that Gress was a very successful sporting estate, with annual bag including deer, grouse, which appear to be very plentiful, snipe, plover, woodcock, pigeon, wildfowl, curlew, hares, along with salmon, sea trout and brown trout. From that you can tell that they were a pretty trigger-happy lot that were in Gress Lodge at this time. Next slide, Colin. And the next one again. This here is the oldest report that we have of Gress. It is dated from 1886, and it's a report to the Fishery Board for Scotland, carried out by its inspector, Mr. Young, who did an inspection of all the estates on the island at the time. I'm not sure if I can read how much I did, but it says there, the Gress falls into a sort of sea loch or lagoon, dry at low water. The lower part winds considerably and has a very slight fall. The consequence is that the pools are long, still and deep, requiring wind to make the fish rise. So everybody that fishes the saltings knows that's exactly what it is. Here the sea trout fishing is often very good, and occasionally also that for salmon. The gamekeeper told me that he had... So hold on, I've got a paper copy of this, so I might be able to read it later. The gamekeeper told me that he has seen 25 sea trout and 5 salmon taken on this part of the river by a single rod in one day. I think carrots was transported back in time for that one. That's just as usual for a one day on Gress. But it really shows you how even back in this time, 1886, Gress was a really good river, and according to the gamekeeper, the total take on the river amounted to usually about 50 salmon and 500 sea trout a year. Yet the Gress is scarcely as large as the water of Leith that Edinburgh is. He concludes it by saying it's a splendid average for so small a river, which it certainly was. I think that period, from the 1890s through to about 1913, was pretty much the glory days of Gress, when it really was one of the best on the island for sea trout and salmon catches. Okay, the next slide, Colin. Short-term leases continued until Herbert Davis, a London accountant, took a 4-year lease from 1890. By this time, the annual rent had increased to £400, which shows how good a sporting estate Gress was. It was during this period that John Bickerdyke visited and wrote his famous book, Days in Thule With Rod, Gun and Camera. Not only does this book cover the sporting activities from the lodge, but also haddock fishing in Broad Bay, which he described as the most notable haddock fishery in the kingdom. It also includes photos of some of the characters he encountered during his stay. There's photos of 3 other gillies that were on Gress in 1894, and I've got them here. So if you go to the next slide, Colin. So this one here we have identified. I'm just wondering if anybody else in the audience tonight can make any family likeness for that. I don't want Bommy or Prof to tell me because they already know. But the clue was his name was Kenny, and he survived a boat tragedy in Broad Bay prior to being a gillie at Gress. And once I found out who it was, the family, and I could see the family connection straight away. Is anybody else in the sea? No? It was Kenneth Morrison, 35 back. He was Shodasyuk's of New Street Back's grandfather. So he'd be the great-grandfather of Angus Morrison, the ex-editor of the Whakatūa News, and also Willie Angie Morrison. So we identified him, and I can see the family likeness there straight away. Next slide, Colin. The next one was another one who survived a boating tragedy, this time in the Minch. His name was Murdo, and he was named Long Murdo, who was obviously the mother of a few Murdos, and this was a taller one. So he was called Long Murdo in the book, and I don't know if anyone can see, is there any, I certainly haven't identified who this could be, but what family it belongs to, but obviously it was a family from the district, and there probably are people from that family still living here now. But I mean, I can see some similarity somewhere, but I can't picture it at all who it is. Does anybody else see anything? And the last one, I don't think we'll get this one. I don't think we'll. This is another Kenny, but this was a long Kenny. The Kenny that we identified was a jolly Kenny, apparently. He was so Bickerdyke had his own name for them all. So this one was long Kenny again, and I don't think we'll ever find out who this one was either, unless some family somewhere has old photos from back in the 1890s. So that was the 3 of the gillies that he had there. We've also managed to get hold of the catch returns for Bickerdyke's season at Gress, and it amounted to 100 salmon, 55 sea trout and 60 brown trout. But they were heavily involved in grouse shooting, shooting pigeons out of the caves at Gress, shooting rabbits down in Tolsta. So it's all in the book anyway, if anybody's interested in it. And it also gives details of the gillies ball held in the Gress Lodge at the end of the season. And I think Bickerdyke must have been a fairly popular character, because apparently all the gillies were really sad to see him leave the island that year. Okay then, next slide, Colin. Short-term leases continued up to 1914, with very respectable game and fish records returned during that period. In 1914, an ambitious new regime for shooting and fishing in Lewis was to be introduced, with J.A. Lumley and Dowell of London as the sole letting agents. A booklet was published, a copy of which I obtained about 25 years ago. It's another of the ones I haven't got a clue where I got it from, but it's a cracking wee book. It covers all the estates on the island, full of adverts and things as well. And what does it say about Gress? Let's have a look. Next slide, Colin. Oh, it's actually going to read it. Gress Lodge, beautifully situated on the shore of Broad Bay, contains on ground floor dining room, gun room, kitchen, scullery, pantry, servants' hall and wine cellar. On first floor, sitting room, 5-bedroom, housemaid's closet, bathroom, WC, and 3 attics for servants. Is that still the case, Kenny? And they had 3-stalled stable, coach house used as garage, kennel and garden, also gamekeeper's house. Post and telegraph office at back, about 2 miles distant, and a letter carrier calls at the lodge daily. Next slide, Colin. They then went into the salmon and sea trout fishing on the rivers Gress and Call, and it included a list of the brown trout lochs. There's a lot more than that, but they counted Backavat, Grinyavat, 2 of this name. I'm not sure where the 2 Loch Grinyavats were. I think there was one called Loch Grinyavat in Yor. And there's the Loch Grinyavat that we know beside Loch Harn and Loch Langevat. And there's Loch Tarstavat, Loch Undergrow, which is down at Glen Tolsta, Loch Olavat, 2 of these names, and Loch Earsgrow and Loch Inyor. But there's more than that. And we're into the catch returns for the previous 5 years, which you can see were fairly respectable. The rent was £30 a month for May, June and July, but then you can see from 4th of August it jumped to £400 for the rest of the season. So the rent had continued going up in all that time. And finally there was brown trout lochs for August, September with a rent of £20 per month. But they went to stay in the lodge. Accommodation will be arranged for tenants at the farm or at the manse. So the trout fishing clients basically had to find their own accommodation. Oh yeah, that booklet, like I said, it also has a lot more information than just the estates. It covers things like train timetables from London, King's Cross and Euston stations to Kyle-Loch-Alsh. Then the David McBrain ferry sailings from Mallock and Kyle-Loch-Alsh to Stornoway. It also lists hotels in Stornoway and car hire or taxi firms on their rates. There were 8 cars available in Stornoway. The Great War of 1914 to 1918 prevented this scheme from taking place, and by the end of the war the island had changed ownership again with a sale from the Matheson family to Lord Leverhulme in 1918. Leverhulme's difficulties with the farm at Gress are well documented elsewhere, but during his ownership of the estate, the sporting rights were reserved exclusively for his guests at Stornoway Castle from 1919 until 1923. In 1923, Leverhulme decided to give up Lewis and offered it free of charge to the people of the island. Stornoway Town Council unanimously accepted his offer to take over all his properties in Stornoway and crofting land in the parish of Stornoway, including Gress. Leverhulme also offered the remaining crofting land and the rest of Lewis free of charge to the Lewis District Council, but this offer was rejected by a majority vote of 6 to 3 at a meeting of the District Council as being too much of a financial risk. So Leverhulme had no option but to sell off the remainder of the Lewis estate minus the parish of Stornoway. These were parcelled up and sold as small estates, some with considerable difficulty due to the financial depression of the 1920s. But what a glorious missed opportunity that was for the people of Lewis to become their own landlords, because this included the likes of Gramerstow, Garnaheine, Uig. All these were just still private estates. In 1924, the Gress River came under the Shootings and Fishings Committee of the newly formed Stornoway Trust. They initially retained the existing gamekeeper and river watching team and still attracted sporting tenants. But things had changed after the Great War and the financial depression, and they gradually reduced the river watching team to save costs. This of course led to an increase in poaching. There was even a report from a trustees meeting in 1939 of the gamekeeper being chased and stoned by a gang of poachers. I have no doubt that this was an incident that has gone down in local folklore, but probably not heard of by many alive today. The story of the red-haired poachers. I didn't think it was heard of by many alive today until I saw that it was in the Back in Time book or magazine for last year, so everybody probably knows about it now. My late uncle John Murray told me of this incident, and he seemed to have an unhealthily good knowledge of the events. Apparently a group of poachers had been spotted by the gamekeeper, and he couldn't apprehend them. He noted that one of the poachers had red hair, so some poor unfortunate lad in the village, known locally as Ginger, was arrested and found guilty on the word of the keeper. According to my late uncle's account, this lad was probably the only guy in the village not involved in poaching. This caused great anger in the village, and a group of men went to confront the keeper. Apparently the gamekeeper locked himself in the watcher's hut out the river to avoid their wrath. I'm pretty sure that this wasn't the story Back in Time didn't say there was any sort of confrontation, but knowing the characters involved, like my own late Uncle John and the likes of Charles Sioyan, they were hardy guys, and I don't think they would have taken too kindly to poor Ginger being sent to jail. Where the story gets more surreal is the account then that the lads in the village entered a float at that year's carnival titled The Red-Haired Poachers, with everyone on the float having false red hair. It didn't win any awards, but it was apparently the most popular float on the day. And just a few weeks after that event, most of these guys involved in that were away fighting in the Second World War after that. During the Second World War, the Trust decided to abandon Gress for sporting purposes. and dispensed with the services of the estate gamekeeper. Gress Lodge was then used as a storage facility for the Lewes Hospital. In 1945, the Trust let the Gress estate to Mr. Harry Gilbert Holmes on the provision that he was responsible for looking after the estate at his own expense. I think this may have been Mr. Holmes' second lease at Gress, as in 1930 Mr. H.G. Holmes took a one-year lease out. A somewhat eccentric character, he was well liked in the district and is still remembered by older inhabitants in the village. Mr. Holmes employed a young Murdo MacDonald, Swannie's brother, as his gamekeeper. A letter enclosed with this article written by Murdo to David Jones in reply to a query for his books best describes Mr. Holmes' period at Gress. Okay, next slide, Colin. So this was a reply that when David Jones was trying to find out as much as he could about the estates, he knew that Murdo was the last gamekeeper in Gress and got in touch with him. I think it was via Swannie actually that he managed that. And the reply was basically, I think Murdo really did respect Mr. Holmes. He says he was a real aristocrat, a gentleman of noble birth, more so on his mother's side. He was educated at Harrow, yeah, as was his prodigy, Winston Churchill. A Tory through and through. Nationalisation means our ruin was his war cry at the 47 elections. He was also an accomplished piper and turned down a commission in the Seaforth Highlanders to serve as a private in the regimental pipe band. Among other things, he taught me to play the bagpipes, as a result of which I rep a wife for 40 years and served for 30 years as an officer in the Glasgow Police Pipe Band. You will understand why I speak highly of the man himself. He goes on further down. Mr. Holmes spent a major part of his first year of tenancy killing off old grouse cocks. His systematic grouse pruning resulted in such a rapid increase in grouse coveys. A good day with a setter and a pointer and a lab retriever, he could bag anything from 9 to 13 brace a day. Mind you, was a damn good shot. Carries on down there about during the war years, the Gress River, which at one time was considered one of the best salmon rivers in the island, had been poached to death by local lads, and all the grand pools once constructed on the upper reaches had broke loose due to lack of maintenance. So it was that in Mr. Holmes' time the poaching went on, perhaps more so because many of these involved were just back from the war. Then Mr. Holmes put a notice up in the window of the village post office. A poacher's ceilidh will be held at Gress Lodge on such and such a date. All poachers warmly invited. It was thought to be a joke, but the poachers turned out, and over a 36-gallon barrel of 5X beer, a pact was agreed upon. Next slide, Colin. Basically, it was agreed that the poachers would not poach the estuary or the sea, and that they would give Mr. Holmes a fair share of their catch from the pools. And Murdo states that many a time in the morning he'd find 2 or 3 salmon on the doorstep. So we've got no records of how many salmon were caught in Mr. Holmes' period, but obviously he did reach a settlement of some kind with the local poachers. What we have then is, unfortunately, poor old Mr. Holmes fell foul of the factor of the Stornoway Trust by carrying out archaeological digs at Gress and was obliged to relinquish his lease on the Gress estate in 1949. Mr. Holmes was the last of what you would call the sporting tenants of the Gress estate. Mr. Holmes was succeeded at Gress Lodge by Dr. Jack Gregg, physician in charge of the Lewes Hospital. Although a keen fisherman, the lease was primarily for a family home at Gress Lodge. I have managed to retrieve catch returns for this period from the Marine Scotland database, and although most years were pretty poor, with a few salmon and a modest number of sea trout recorded, there was one exception to this in 1965, when 25 salmon and 150 sea trout were recorded. I wonder why this year was so different from the rest of the period. Do you recall if anything happened at Gress Lodge in 1965? Were there any visitors? Because all the other years of your father's time, there was 2, 3 salmon, 20, 30 sea trout, and suddenly 1965 was a complete a complete change to things with 25 salmon and 150 sea trout can't be accounted for. One theory, I don't know, there had a curveball thrown into the equation in the last couple of weeks about T.B. Macaulay, the businessman from Stornoway, who born in 1896, died in 1984 and was buried in Gress, and apparently, according to his obituary in the Stornoway Gazette, for many years held the fishing rights to Gress Pool, as it said. But we don't know how he held the fishing rights to Gress Pool when Dr. Gregg had the tenancy at the time, unless he came to some agreement with him. It was sublet to T.B. Macaulay. Well, that answers that. And I've got no, he was apparently an exceptional fisherman. So I think he'd have been about 70 in 1965, so there's hope for us yet, Ian, but by the time we reach that age, we can still be... That could very well answer where that year came from. Yep. In 1974, Dr. Gregg formed the Gress Angling Association and became president of the association. John MacDonald Swanee was elected chairman, Willie McKeever the treasurer, with Jock McLennan, Norman Sonny Stewart and Dan McCaskill as committee members. I remember a meeting at back school at that time when a few eager juniors, including myself, Ian Roxburgh, Callum MacDonald and Donald Murray, were present. When Gress Angling Association was reformed in 2002, these 4 juniors would soon be part of the new committee. I remember that meeting we were at in back school, I think it must have been 1974, and I've still got Swanee gave me all the old documents from the old Angling Association. One of the things that struck me from that meeting was that people from Tongue were excluded from joining Gress Angling Association. So there must have been some debate on that, and they were going to review it in the next year, but so Tongue can't have been considered as part of the district at that time, but I don't think we'd get off with it now. In the mid-1970s, the association carried out many river improvement initiatives, including rebuilding the weirs with the assistance of the Job Creation Scheme, which was running at the time, and some restocking with a limited number of salmon fry and par included. Over the years, though, the association ran out of steam until in early 2002, there was a serious risk of Gress Angling Association losing the fishing rights after some stories of mismanagement appeared in the angling press. Private interests were keen to take over Gress River, and a meeting was called by Swanee to gauge if there was enough local support to keep going. A new committee was formed, of which I soon became chairman, and along with Ian Roxburgh, we have between us fulfilled that role since then. We were initially granted a 2-year probationary lease to see if we could improve the situation. And in 2004, Gress Angling Association was given a new 18-year lease, which was renewed last year with a further 20-year lease. The association is currently in a good place with membership of over 150 every year. The salmon fishing has fluctuated over the years, and we were doing really well up to 2013 with regular annual catches of over 30 salmon a year, and a bumper year in 2009 when 63 salmon were caught, which put the river on a par with the glory years between 1870 and 1913. Since 2013, though, there's been a worrying decline in salmon catches, as has been the case with all the other island fisheries. But the sea trout fishing has been exceptional, and Gress is without doubt now the best single river system on the island for sea trout. And the returns we're getting on sea trout are really very good, and they do match any of the returns back in the East Victorian times, while a lot of other sea trout rivers have completely collapsed. We're probably the best single river system on the island now. Next slide then, Colin. Many improvements have been carried out, including repairing the weirs and most importantly improving fish spawning areas. Myself, John Ormontoe and MacLeod and Ian Roxburgh took on mink trapping duties, and in a 3-year period we disposed of 60 mink from the main spawning areas before the island-wide scheme was initiated to eradicate them from the island. We have also tried to keep the children in the area engaged in angling, and over the last 20 years have hosted many kids' open days. The kids from the last year were just as keen as the ones from 20 years ago, which was evident from the more than 100 children attending our organised events this last season. hopefully the future of Gress River looks bright, with even a few of these kids take up angling. The last slide of this bit of it, that's just two of the older kids' days. You can see there's some bright characters amongst this lot. And all these guys are adults now, so I don't know if any of them are even in here tonight. Right, and now we'll start our next section, which is our walk from the Gress estuary all the way to Loch Gress, which I'm hoping to do in about 20 minutes rather than 4 hours. We've identified 29 named pools in total so far, but as you can see on the map, I've drawn this is a map of the lower section with the lochs painted in blue, which we have at the moment, which are the two Loch Olivats on the left, Loch Carn and Loch Langvat on the right. Next slide, please, Colin. And continuing out, Loch Grinnevat, Loch Duskiaskro, Loch Nadake, Loch Nyor, Loch Hopper, which is one of a visitor from Ireland's favourite, Philip, does the trek every year out there, which takes him half the day there and half the day back, I think. And the yellow line that you can see marked across there is actually the boundary of the Gress fishery. So most of you probably wouldn't be aware, but Loch Gress isn't actually part of the Gress fishery. Loch Gress is part of the Galston estate. You can see Loch Gress up there in the top middle of it. So it's a fair distance out. Okay, next slide then. Right then, we start here at the first pool on the river, which is the sea pool, named in Gaelic Ian Rang, which translates to the busy pool, or we've named it the working pool. It's a deep pool at the corner there, so salmon and sea trout can come into it at pretty much any state of tide. And I remember an event that took place here in the mid-1970s when we were all school kids, a really hot, dry summer, and in the early afternoon the heavens opened out on the moor, torrential thunderstorms, and suddenly the river went into a big spate. So a few of us playing down there at the time. Somebody lobbed a boulder into the river, and then bedlam ensued as a whole shoal of salmon took off into the shallows, with half the kids in the village chasing them up to their knees in water. So I remember that I caught one in my hands. Donald Martin caught one, Mac Donald Uphill. Derek Grimm, Max Andy Fjord caught one as well. And then the professionals arrived with nets, but to the best of my recollection, they didn't catch any more. So the pool certainly lived up to its busy or working pool that next day. Next slide, Colin. So the next stretch up the river, we come on to the saltings. This first stretch is where we carry out the sweep netting with the Fisheries Trust for tagging of sea trout. But it also holds a distinction at the top end of it. There's a deep pot up there, which I was always told was called Poilvoltaine, but I haven't seen it written anywhere else, but that's what I was told, so I'm sticking with it. And allegedly this is where the biggest salmon ever caught on the river was landed, which was well over 20 pounds, but it was caught by poachers trawling a net in the 1930s. So next slide, Colin. This shows the kids on back school. A few years ago we took them down for an outing with the Stornoway Fisheries Trust for the sweep netting. Next one, Colin. And this is them just measuring. This is what they were doing. They measure and weigh the fish, tag them and release them. They haven't done Gress now for a few years, but hopefully they'll continue this in the next few years. Next slide, Colin. The pools on the this is the first of the main fishing pools on the saltings, which is the Guigneru, the black pool. All the salting pools, as mentioned in our report, they're slow moving, they're deep, they hide fish. Fish come in there, you see them the first day, then they disappear. You know they're still there, they're hiding, and the banks are deep, they undercut as well. So that's a black pool there, and you're looking up further upriver up to the graveyard. Next one, Colin. And here's a certain somebody in the graveyard pool, which in my 50 years of fishing the graveyard pool, I've caught one salmon in the graveyard pool. And this was it here. The saltings really are not known for catching salmon for some reason. See, they account for most of the sea trout on the river, but salmon, we see them in numbers, we see them come in, but it's very rare that we actually catch any of them. Like I said, they disappear within a couple of days, and the banks there are really deep, and they undercut and they're hiding under there. They pop their nose out now and then just to let you know they're there, just to drive you mad, but you hardly ever get one. Next one, Colin. Except this poor soul, which I managed to land and put them safely back in again. So that was a graveyard pool. Next one, Colin. This is looking downriver now, down to the Stony Pool, which is the next one up from the graveyard pool, in Yachlachoch. Another deep one, but on a hot, bright summer day, you can actually see the big boulders which lie in the bottom of this pool, which are the hiding places. And some of the biggest sea trout that have been taken off the river usually get taken from the Stony Pool for some reason. Next one, Colin. Next one is Linkbunafay, the marsh pool, so named because of the marsh coming into it in that top left corner. As you can see, all the pools there are pretty much named due to the features around them. Next one, Colin. The next one is Linkbunahoylch, the burn pool. This is the pool where Altacharakol comes into it, the burn which comes down from Loch Olavat. We cleared this burn all the way from the lochs right down to its source quite a few years ago now, hoping to entice sea trout or even salmon up into this burn, up into the lochs. As yet, we haven't landed any in the lochs. Some anglers have reported that they've hooked big fish in the Loch Olavats, but as yet we haven't hooked any. But encouragingly enough, the last electrofishing survey that the Fisheries Trust did of Alt Caracol, they did find salmon fry and salmon par in it, which indicates that salmon are actually spawning in that burn. Next one, Colin. Next one is the Kulk, the reed pool, so named obviously with the reeds that lie inside of it. Next one, Colin. Right then, we come next to an interesting little feature which's got a bit of history to it. This ditch that you see in the middle there is between Kulk, the reed pool, and Inyanaf, the stag pool. It's a 20-foot wide ditch, and apparently in the 1800s this was the site where it's named Layman's Keybath, Angus the Shepherd's Jump. And the story goes that Angus Mackay from Achmore, who came to Gress as a shepherd in the 1800s, was chased by a bull and cornered at the ditch. The only escape for Angus was to jump over this ditch, a feat which certainly qualified for any Olympic long jump team. And the story goes that he did manage to jump this ditch, but I'm sure if I was being chased by an angry bull, I'd probably spout wings and clear that ditch as well. This supreme athlete was the late Sandy Fuath, Sandy Grimm, 27 Black's great-grandfather. Next slide, Colin. This one is Inyanaf, which you can see in the bottom left side where the shepherd's leap is. And this is Inyanaf, it's either the heifer pool or the stag pool. So we've gone for the stag pool as being the more obvious one. We don't know if any heifers fell in here and drowned. We've gone for the stag pool as the name anyway. Next one, Colin. This here is the Drochidru, the Black Bridge. First built in 1930 as a gesture to appease parents in Gress who were not very happy about their children having to walk to back school in all sorts of weather conditions. It didn't really reduce the walking distance by that much, but it may have added a little bit of comfort at the time. The next one, Colin. Right then, apparently this bridge was destroyed by river ice in 1974, but rebuilt by Army engineering cadets from Oxford University in 1976. So I don't know how true it was with the river ice, but you can see some of the conditions that this bridge has had to withstand. And this was actually a July spate, believe it or not. And some of the winter spates would probably be covering the wooden footboards on the bridge. So the bridge has subsequently been repaired by the Trust again in 2021 after concerns were raised about from the Angling Association about the condition for its users. If you go back one slide again, Colin, this is a feature that I've got. I don't know if you can just see it upriver of the top wooden slats. You can see a small crossing on the river. Now this was called Staranamoddanich, or the Woman's Path. This is a rough pathway of stones across the river and was used by the women when they were going out and coming back with milk from the sheelings. Okay, Colin, you can go ahead too now. Right, the next pool up from the wooden bridge is Dinighay, the Red Rock Pool, named after the striking red-coloured rock face on the back bank of the river. Next one up is, next one, Colin. Next one up is Dinighay, the Mason's Pool. So named because this is where the village stonemason had his habitation. This, we can only assume, was the stonemason who built the dikes at the farms at Abercall and Gress. And you can still see the agricultural lazy beds, which are litter the area. This was us rebuilding the weir at it. That was Neil Stewart adding the final pieces. As you can see, it was mostly a Gabion feature that we had to make to get this pool back into service again. And if you see the next slide, Colin, that is the pool now in fully operational use, and a cracking wee pool for salmon and sea trout. Next slide, Colin. Last of the pools before the climb into the gorge is perhaps one of the most famous or infamous pools on the river, Dinighay, the Chair Pool. This is a pool with a tragic history. It was here that 2 young sisters drowned in 1952. The pool derives its name from the chair-like rock structure in the middle of the pool, with a waterfall flowing down both sides of it. The strange thing about this pool now is that over the years it's never been known to be any good for salmon or sea trout. And I've noticed myself fly fishing in it, that the fly line actually goes back up towards the rock, which means that there is an undercurrent here. So the waterfall is obviously doing a turbulence, bringing the water back to the chair itself. And maybe that contributed to why these poor girls drowned there instead of being washed down the river as you would expect of anyone else that would fall into a pool. Okay, the next one, Colin. Upriver from the chair, the flow of the river increases quickly as we come to a rising section known as the gorge. A series of natural and man-made pools make up this section, starting with Dinighay. This is Dinighay here. We don't know who Dolly was. Charles Yoyan in his article thinks that maybe she was one of the daughters of one of the hunters at the lodge, but we've got absolutely no records of this being the case, so it's something we would never find out, but that's Dinighay anyway. The next one up from Dinighay is Dinighay, which is, I haven't got a photo of that one, but it's basically the coffin pool, named after a coffin because it's got steep rock sides on both sides of it and not very easily fished. Okay, the next one is Dinighay, as giving it its full title, which basically means the foolish woman pool. There's been some thoughts that maybe it could be Dinighay. Kenny Connocan made that assumption, but there was in Bickerdyke's book a story of a woman drowning in a pool, falling in with a creel on her back. And Kenny was thinking maybe it was a creel woman pool, Dinighay, but the pool that Bickerdyke had was much further out the river, so it's not that one at all. This was us repairing this weir a couple of years back, and you can see the actual amount of stone that is required to get these weirs into a proper state to withstand the spates, and especially the winter time. Next slide, Colin. So this then is Dinighay in its full glory. Beautiful pool, and holds quite a few salmon and sea trout, as you'll see in the next one. This is a cracking salmon landed by a young lad from Aberdeenshire who was fishing on Gress for the first time ever with his dad. I think it must have been 10 years ago or so. Landed this cracking 6-pound fresh run salmon. I happened to be on the scene myself as usual just to photograph it, but it certainly made that young fella's day. Next one, Colin. Next pool up is one of the famous pools on the river, Dinighay, the gorge pool, and you can see it here again in its full spate condition. The top end of the pool has got a waterfall flowing into it with a fairly narrow sort of opening, and apparently this is where in the old days you'd be able to cross the river by jumping between 2 rocks. It's called in Dinighay the leap. Kenny Connaughton actually showed me this one dry summer's day when he quite easily leapt across it as the rocks were nice and dry, but I certainly wouldn't like to try it with the rocks wet and slippery. So next slide. This is a certain angler again with Mr. Roxburgh, I think, on the camera as per usual, seeing myself hooked into a salmon. This is the gorge pool in its ideal fishing condition. White froth blowing down it, a good wind blowing down it. Next one, and that was the salmon that came out of it that day. Next slide then, Colin. The next pool up from the gorge pool is Dinacharrick, the big rock pool. This has got a waterfall flowing down both sides of it. I would imagine that in Victorian times it was fished from the Gress side, which is by far the best side to fish it from because you have plenty of area to fish from. Over on the back bank there's very little working area there. I've landed 5 salmon there over the years. Only one of them has been from the back side. I've lost a few on the back side. Over on the Gress side, everyone I've ever hooked have landed. So I think that tells its own story about which side to fish that one from. But it's getting over there, that's the problem. Okay then, next slide. Just upriver from Dinacharrick is the slide, as we call it in Clyde. Any of you that have seen the Falls of Shin, this I consider to be a miniature version of it. It's basically a sloping rocky bed that salmon, if you ever were lucky enough to see them, you'd see them flying up through that. Unfortunately, I haven't seen it myself. Next one, Colin. Right, and the next of the pools on the river is a small pool just below the big pool. You can see it here under construction by us in a dry summer when it's completely drained and you can actually get work like this done. So this pool was named Craig's Pool after the late Craig Morrison, who was one of the juniors who was helping with that pool. Next one, Colin, and this shows the pool in its full working condition, holding water and ready for salmon. Next one, Colin. Next pool on the river is the big pool, which is the biggest pool on the river, strangely enough, and one of the best pools for fishing. Next one, Colin. This was a young lad, Naseemak's grandson, Ali Brodie, who came home on holiday a few years ago. His grandfather got in touch with me to ask me would I take him out to the river because he didn't want to let him out to the pools on his own. So I gladly took him out to the pools, and I think it was his first cast into the big pool, hooked into a salmon, or no, sorry, it was a sea trout. And his line, when you can see all the fly line lying at his feet because his reel went into a complete fankle, but he expertly managed to land it. Next one, Colin. And there he was with a 5-pound sea trout, which, I mean, this lad went on to represent Scotland in angling competitions. He was a very good angler when I first met him as a youngster, but he still remembers. He comes up every year, himself and his mate in a camper van, and he still says that sea trout he caught on Gress was probably the best fish he ever landed. Next one, Colin. This is another dry summer fixing the next to the pools. This is the pool above the big pool, and it's strangely enough called the small pool, Inivuk. And we repaired this a few years ago. And the next slide, Colin, you can see it in its full spate condition again. You can see the difference between the dry summers and then when the rains finally come into these pools. Next one, Colin. Next pool up is Linure, the new pool. This probably wasn't built at the same time as the Victorian ones, which why it got the Linure name. We reckon this was probably after the Trust era that this pool was built. But it's got a special distinction, as you can see from the next slide, as this is where the biggest salmon caught in recent times on Gress River was landed by Régis Philippe. 15-pound salmon, and I think Ian Roxburgh was there to help land it, and I think, Bunter, were you there that day as well?
I think so, yeah.
I think it was a combined effort.
He phoned me while he had it on the line.
He phoned you while he had it on the line. Well, I did that one I had in the big rock pool with Ian Roxburgh. We didn't have the same outcome. But this was a terrific fish. But you can see the state of the river, it's flooded behind him as well. And we've seen big fish on Gress River does have big fish on it. The usual size is your 5-pounders, but you know, some of these big fellas are on there. Okay, the next one, Colin. Next one is a strange area of the river. This is an area of the river called Scarashkir. Now, it's locally been shortened to Erashkir. I don't know why. Now, Sharzioyan makes out that Erashkir is a Norse name for a farm. But I've checked I've got my own Norse place names dictionary at home, and I can't find Erashkir being a farm. It is an area of green. There is cultivation on it, but surprisingly enough, the old Norse word ska means a low-lying area of land. And you can see from there it is a low-lying area of land. And skir, again, is the Old Norse coming into the Gaelic for a rock. It's predominantly a sea rock, but it has been used in freshwater rocks as well. So I think that it could be more a low-lying area of land with a rock. But the Gaelic for scar, again, is a division or a separation, so it could very well as well be a separation between rough moorland and arable land, because in that area, on that bend, you do have the arable land there. Now then, there is reason, the last people that inhabited this was a couple, a brother and sister from Flodderby in Harris, and they were the last known shepherds, Alexander and Mary McKinnon, and they were there in the 1870s, so the place became known as Buarnaherich after them. Both these individuals married and settled in the district. Mary married John McLean of Six Back, and she lived to the age of 95, and she was still remembered by my own father's generation. And Alexander married Jessie Campbell of 14 Back, and they settled in town. So they were the last inhabitants of this area, Scarashkir. If you go on Google Earth, you can actually see the lazy beds very easily on that. So there was cultivation here, there was oats and potatoes grown here. And it's also one of the main spawning areas on the river, which we carried out major improvements on 3 years ago, where a whole summer was spent improving the spawning gravel in this area, which has proved pretty successful since then. Next slide. That's just the Scarashkir area again, and the stones in the next one. This is the Scarashkir stone at the top end of this area of the river. Next one. Right in, this one here is Lín Alten Harstad, or the Roaring Stream Pool. It's got a small weir on it, which we fully intend to get a proper, full-blown repair done on it in the next year or so. You can see the stream coming into it there on the right-hand side. That's Alten Harstad, Harstad meaning roaring noise, which comes down from Loch Carn and then from Loch Langevat. Next one. This is up at Loch Langevat, which we came upon. It's a dam system known in Gaelic as a seuhid, and this was used in Victorian times to hold back the water in lochs for then releasing. They used to fit wooden boards. You can see where my arms are. Wooden boards were fitted there. Loch Langevat to the back of it. This would have raised the level of this loch by anything up to 5 feet. So it would hold a vast amount of water. There's another seuhid in Gress village itself for a totally different purpose, and that's the one on Navinvo, which was used for releasing water to turn the wheel of the mill at Gress. Okay, the next one. Out in this area of the river as well, there's one of the oldest monuments on the island, which is Carnavark, or possibly Carnavarp, because it's an example of one of the bark cairns. This is the only one that I know of in Lewis, but there are 3 or 4 in the Uists. There's a couple in Skye, and there's some in mainland Highlands as well. Next slide, Colin. They were chambered cairns, but as you can see, the one out at Gress Moor there, there's no sign of the chambered cairns anymore. They've been the stones have long since been scattered. But they reckon that these monuments are up to 5,000 years old. One of the ones in Uist apparently still has the chambered cairns visible, and it's quite impressive to see on the internet. Next one, Colin. The next is one of the Bickerdyke pools. He named these the step pools. And in Gaelic they're called the Glumichin and Alish. So we didn't know what Alish was, but Al is another of the Gaelic words for rocks, or a rock. There's many words in Gaelic and Old Norse for rock and stone, and Al is another one. So it could very well just easily be the rocky pools. As you can see, there are a amount of rocks in it, but Bickerdyke named them the step pools. Next one, Colin. The next pool we come to is at the road end, the end of the peat track, which is Lignadi Vorochi, the Shieling Pool. This is on the way out to the dam. You cross the river here and carry on out to Paddy's track, which was the track used by the tractor driver in the construction of the dam in the 1950s. And it's well worth a cast in this wee pool on the way out, on the way back in. Next one, Colin. And this is the old waterworks dam itself, which on its day you can have some really incredible fishing in there. And say 10 years ago when you went out there, you were guaranteed salmon or sea trout. When myself and Ian used to go out there, we actually used to draw lots to see who would fish the bottom end of it and who would fish the top end of it. But nowadays you just want to get out there on your own. You don't want anybody else there because the number of fish just don't appear to be as many. And there's nothing worse than trekking all the way out there to find that some of the blighters out there before you, because you only usually get one pass at the dam, because once you've gone through it once, the fish seem to realise that you're there and they just go hide deep under the banks. Next one, Colin. Right, then this here's either a good situation or a nightmare situation. You've hooked into a salmon in probably the worst area of the dam to hook it into. I hooked into this one right at the very bottom end, right beside the weir. And Ian was here, of course, again with camera to note it all. At this stage you've got to try to get this fish clear of the weir. But this one thought it was Steve McQueen from The Great Escape. And the next slide, it jumped clean over the weir on me and ran down the river with me in hot pursuit. And it was still, luckily it was still on the fly, which I was most surprised at. So the poor's all got landed further, about 50 yards further down than I intended to land it. And he was safely returned to the river. And I saw him a few minutes later up at the sluice again, wondering what on earth he was doing down on this end of it again, how to jump back over. Next one, Colin. And this was Ian, just again to prove that he could catch salmon as well. So yes, these were the days where you were guaranteed fish in the dam. I know it's hit or miss unless you're carrots, of course, which is a hit every time, rather than anybody else. Next one. This was what a typical catch at the dam would be: a 5-pound grilse and a 3-pound sea trout. This was you can see the freshness of these fish. The dam is 5 miles out, and these fish haven't been on the river more than a day, so they've really absolutely just shot. They've shot up there. And of course these were the days when you could keep a salmon. We're not allowed to keep salmon on Gress River anymore. We're a category 3 river, which means that it's mandatory catch and release, which is unfortunately the condition of most of the west coast of Scotland rivers now. Next one. This is an interesting area of the river, which I will say, I went out 2004, I think it was. I was going to walk to Loch Gress. I was doing hand-drawn maps as I was going, just to find out where all the reds were. So I did hand drawings all the way out, and I just came upon this area, known locally as a Mooban, and it pretty much was a light bulb moment, because it just suddenly occurred to me, in Bickerdyke's book, he mentioned the White Bow Pool, and we didn't know where the White Bow Pool was, and then Mooban, it just became daylight. Mooban, the Fair Bend, so that's the White Bow. Once we found this one out, the rest were absolutely easy after that. This was the one that opened the gates to finding all the other Bickerdyke pools. Next one, Colin, and that is the White Bow Pool itself. Next one, uproad from that is the Major's Pool. There's no Gaelic name for it. It's just one of the ones that Bickerdyke had in his book. Who the Major was, we'll never know. They used to catch plenty salmon out in these pools. We haven't caught any, because the pools are now absolutely full of wee brown trout. You can't get a fly into the water. within seconds the brown trout are onto it straight away. So if there's any salmon in there, you're just not getting a chance to fish for them. Probably in the old days, the kids and the sheelings would have been hauling these brown trout out to add to their diet, which probably helped the anglers in that time. Next one. This is the last of the pools on the river before we get to the loch. And this is Paul Behak, which we think is a Joanna's pool from Bickerdyke's book again. And finally, we come to Loch Gress itself. But the strange thing now about Loch Gress is the junction, Loch Gress, a small stream goes up to it. But the bigger area of water of the river continues round the back of Monarch with a stream called Aldebrahing. Now this stream is bigger than the stream that goes to Loch Gress, so maybe the source of the River Gress is actually where Aldebrahing rises. Now Aldebrahing is another one which I think adds a bit of history too. There was history in the village of an illicit whisky still. Always used to hear rumours, and the late Donald Grimm, 8 back in 38 Gress, he recalled that there was an illicit whisky still somewhere in Gress, but he didn't know where it was. Now, does anyone know what brahing is? Gaelic scholars anywhere? Brahing? A quern. And a quern or quern or whatever. What's a quern used for? Mashing barley. Now, why would anybody be mashing barley out at the back of Monarch? So, I think this very well could be, if there was an illicit whisky still, I think this is potentially where it could have been, well out of the sight of any excise men. And I don't think they'd be mashing, if they were making oatcakes or whatever, I think they'd have taken the oatcakes out from the village. And they wouldn't have been growing barley out there. So that's the end of my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. I don't know how long it's taken.
Well, we've certainly enjoyed it. I found it fascinating. I'm sure you liked it. It was a fascinating journey through the history of Gress River and also along Gress River. It was so informative, Alasdair, and fantastic. And I think you've got stuff in that box that people can look at.
Oh yeah,
a cup of tea, odds and ends. So after you get a cup of tea and something to eat, or before, have a look at what Alasdair has here. And I'm sure you'll all join me in the usual way to thank Alasdair for his talk.